My name is Kevin Clark. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of the Villanova School of Business. I was asked to come in and serve as a facilitator, timekeeper, guardian of the clock, if you were. And so what I'd like to do is first off welcome you this afternoon to our session. Water for Sale, Measuring the Cost. We're looking at the economics of the privatization of water, a recent phenomenon. We've got a couple of esteemed panelists with us today. Professor James O'Brien is from the College of Engineering, is in the mechanical engineering area. He will be our first presenter, followed by Christopher Kilby, who is an associate professor in the Villanova School of Business in the economics area. He will be our second presenter. And then Barbara Wall, who is the vice president for University Mission and Ministry, who will serve as a discussant, respondent of sorts for us to set up some of the more salient issues that we will then cover in a Q&A, open Q&A. So our intent is to very quickly provide some information to you, to give you a couple of different perspectives and some data, some information, some framing, and then open it up for a general discussion. It will be my job to keep us on schedule. Let me first give you a little bit more detail about our presenters. James O'Brien, our first presenter, has been a tenured faculty member in the Mechanical Engineering Department of Villanova University since 1988. At Villanova, he's won numerous awards for both teaching and in the service realm. His areas of specialization are hydraulics and hydrology. The difference escapes me coming from ESB. Water resources management, computer-aided design, and education and service learning. I think that's a theme we'll see here as well. I know many of the students are involved in water projects in the service learning realm. He's been a faculty advisor on annual and biannual engineering service trips and Engineers Without Borders trips to Panama, Nicaragua, and Thailand since 1992. The trips include evaluating, designing, planning, and assisting in the installation of gravity-fed water systems in remote villages that have no clean water. And we were just joking a few moments ago that we don't have water glasses, but this is not nearly the problem that confronts many of the folks around the globe. Christopher Kilby, our second presenter, is an associate professor of economics. He earned his doctorate from Stanford University in economics. His general area of research is developmental economics, with a specific focus on the political economy of foreign aid. Dr. Kilby's recent work includes projects exploring the role of U.S. interests in determining World Bank lending. And finally, Barbara Wall, who is probably familiar to many of you, is the Vice President of Mission and Ministry and also professor in the Department of Philosophy. She earned her PhD in political philosophy from Marquette University. Dr. Wall has been the Director of Women's Studies, the Center for Peace and Justice Education, and is an expert in Catholic social teaching and the Native American philosophy and spirituality. And as you're all aware, or most of you should be aware, today's session is part of a day-long symposium on the global water crisis, conflict and cooperation. And this demonstrates a collaboration between Catholic Relief Services and the colleges and schools across the university. In 2005, Villanova University, together with 4 other Catholic higher education institutions across the nation, entered into a formal partnership with Catholic Relief Services, the official overseas humanitarian agency of the United States Catholic community. The purpose of the partnership, of which this panel is a demonstration, is to deepen our institutions' respective and shared mission to reduce human misery and promote justice, peace, and global solidarity through collaborating in global education, research, advocacy, and service. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor James O'Brien to the podium and to get us started. Thank you.
Kevin had it right when he said that there were a couple of esteemed professors. There's the couple, and then it's me. We'll see how this goes. All right, we're going to talk. I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of a background, more from an engineering perspective than anything else on what's going on. I'll give you a little introduction, maybe talk a little bit about the ways that people get water, costs associated with water systems, who pays or should pay for them, what's the return on investment, and then some potential areas of conflict I'm going to probably try to give you some perspective from things that I have seen. Real quickly, if you were at the earlier presentation, you would have seen some of these numbers. The most conservative number is 1.1 billion people in the world lack access to improved water systems. Most people say it's closer to 2 billion. All right? We're talking about 1/6 of the world's population. All right? Something we've pretty much never experienced is lack of clean water. To bracket on the other side, the World Health Organization has estimates, and the estimates vary. They've done a lot of different studies, and different people are attaching different costs and different expenses to different things. But they're pretty much saying that per capita, the cost for a water system per year varies between 18 cents and $8, right, a year. So for a person to have water, it would cost $8 a year for that person in Africa, which is the place that's worse off, right? So it would probably be less in other areas. So we're not talking huge amounts of money per capita. As you would probably figure, the people in rural areas are much less likely to have improved water systems than people in urban areas. And obviously the developing countries are where most of the people don't have water systems. Average price of water in the United States is about $1.50 per 1,000 gallons, which is less than 1 cent a gallon. When we go to Nicaragua, we buy big bottles of water, right? They cost about $1 per gallon. Most of the people in that area can't afford to buy big bottles of water. If they're going to buy clean water at all, they're buying smaller bottles at about 85 cents. No, I'm sorry, about $3 a gallon. Right? The smaller bottles cost, if you expand it to a gallon, about $3 a gallon. Some numbers worldwide. In Manila, the poor pay 9 times more than regular customers. In Lagos, 10 times, Cairo, 40 times, Jakarta, 60 times, and Karachi, 83 times. It sounds crazy, but we do the same thing here, right? In other words, if you're a big user of electricity, of water, or something else, you get reduced rates, right? These other countries are doing the same thing, right? It sounds logical, but it doesn't work, because the people who are very poor can't afford to use a lot of water, therefore they've got to pay higher rates than the people who use lots of water. It's kind of like backwards when you think of that in that way. Right? Where do people get water around the world? We all know where we get water. You go into your house and you turn the tap on and the water comes out. Right? That's not where most people get water. They get it from rivers, streams, springs, collecting rainwater, either community or family wells. Sometimes they have to buy it from vendors who drive around visiting each community with trucks. Now, sometimes these trucks are just open barrels of water that the person who's driving the truck went to the river, filled the barrel up, and then went around all the communities selling this water. Other times they're tanker trucks, right, where the people all come out, and the tanker trucks usually it's cleaner water. Or tap stands. And tap stands may be community, in other words, centrally located in the middle of the community, wherever you can go to get it. Or from tap stands located in the houses. There are very few people, other than in the developed countries, that have water taps in their houses or in their homes. Most of them are either outside or in central locations. They might be getting it from wells. And then the two ways that water systems are usually designed and built are either gravity-fed water systems, which means you get water up high and you let the force of gravity fill the system and then distribute it. Right? Or you can get water down low and then pump the water up someplace high, and then again, usually it's gravity that then provides the pressure for the pipes. All right, now just a quick explanation of gravity-fed water system. Normally what you would do is you would go up and you find a stream, a spring preferably, but possibly a stream. Right? You then make up a catchment facility, usually made of concrete, in which you collect the water that's coming up out of the ground in the stream, in the spring, excuse me. Right, you cover it. Then you run pipes from the catchment area down to a storage tank. And then you store your water in that storage tank, which is above the community. So again, gravity will then push the water through another set of pipes into a tap stand. And here you see a community tap stand where everybody goes and collects the water. Oddly enough, it's not oddly enough, but It's usually the kids that get sent to collect the water, or the women. You almost never see the men going to collect water. You see the men maybe drinking the water, or if the man's thirsty, he might go and get some water. But as far as for the maintenance of the family, it's either the children or the women who are doing the work for it. Right? What are the costs associated with the water system? There are capital costs. Costs of pipes and valves and glue and concrete and reinforcement bars for the tanks, gaskets. There's multiple other things. There are labor costs in transporting this stuff. First of all, designing the system, transporting the stuff, building the things, and then installing. All the pipes have to be buried, right? PVC, there's two main types of pipes, galvanized and PVC. PVC deteriorates with the sun, so it has to be buried. Galvanized is very, very heavy and 3 or 4 times as expensive. So almost everybody uses PVC, which means you must be burying it. So it's very labor intensive. There are operating costs, such as chemicals, fuel, things of that sort. Maintenance costs, the pipes break, the pipes deteriorate, valves break, valves start to leak. Right? You need to clean the systems, you need to clean the tanks, you need to clean any place where you store things. You need to test the water to be sure it's still clean. And then you also need some future development. Invariably, you build a water system for a community, and then 5 years, 10 years down the line, the community is twice as big, and people have moved in the peripheral areas of the community, and now they want water also, so the water system has to be expanded. And it might be as simple as running pipes to those homes or those areas, but it might involve enlarging the storage tanks or finding new sources to supplement the old source, because the old source wasn't strong enough or had enough water in it to supply the additional water requirements or demands. What are the costs of not having water? Right? So we just talked about the cost of having water. What are the costs of not having water? Right? Poor health. Right? If you don't have water, right, you get sick. You get malaria. You can't fight off malaria unless you're hydrated. Right? If you get cholera, one of the cures for cholera, the reason the cholera kills you is because it dehydrates you. One of the ways to fight cholera is to keep hydrated. But if you don't have water, you can't keep hydrated, right? So therefore, you're going to die. Right? Malaria requires that you are very much hydrated. Right? It strikes in areas where people have a lack of water, and therefore there's a great, huge death toll from malaria. Childhood mortality. It talks about diarrheal diseases. I can't even say that word. Diarrheal diseases kill about 5,000 children a day. Right? Diarrhea is only one of the waterborne diseases, right, that people get when they don't have clean water. Right? They talk about, I don't know, in kids, 800,000 to 1.5 million children a year are dying due to waterborne illnesses. Right? In addition to those things, there's lost time collecting water. We're talking about up here, we didn't have cups, to drink the water that's put on the table, right? I was kind of thirsty, and I was thinking of asking somebody to run down to Bryn Mawr to get me a drink of water. Because that's what, if you're living in a community, that's what you'd be doing. You'd be running to some place like Bryn Mawr, with a bucket, to fill it up to bring it back, right? So you'd have something to drink. By the time you get back, you have to be drunk anyway, or be spilled, right? And you'd have to be running down again. So an inordinate amount of time is spent every day just getting water for you or your family. And again, people who are spending that time are the children and the women. Right? Because of that, right, the females lose tremendous opportunities to get educated, because the parents are not letting them go to school sometimes because they don't have time to go to school. They have to get water so the family can survive. Right? It always seems to fall on the females. Right? So getting these people water, right, enables the females to get an education. And education pretty much is the source of improvement in all of these communities. How are the costs recovered from water systems that are built? Tariffs, in other words, charges to people. Right? Subsidies from the government. We do that here in the United States. Right? From other sources. Overseas organizations who will contribute to communities. Water for Wisława, right? Helps fund water systems for the people in the District of Nicaragua, Wisława. Microcredit, where people can be given credit for a water system. Social development funds, which again, Water for Wisława is similar to that. And then community funds. Who should pay for these water systems? Right? And if you notice, I don't have a lot of solutions to these questions. I just have questions. Right? Should the government be paying for it? In the United States, the government sometimes contributes to the payment. Frequently what will happen in an area is government will come out and say, we need a water system. We're willing to fund it temporarily. We'll hire an organization or a group or start some kind of a whatever to run the water system. That water system will then charge people over the next 10, 20, 30 years, right, who will eventually pay, hopefully, the bonds back that were taken out to finance these things. That's not viable in most third world countries, so that's probably not going to happen there. Should the communities pay? It would be nice if the communities could pay. If they had money, they would, right? That is how early systems in the United States were done. Communities decided to build the systems themselves, and they kind of took care of it. Should individuals or users? Right? These are the questions that I'm hoping our economists can answer. Should the individuals and users be paying for the water they use? They make about a good salary for somebody in Nicaragua, where we go, would be about $1 to $2 a day. Right? So I'm not sure how much of that money is going to be left for paying for their water systems. Right? And if you consider how much they're making in a year, about $300 a year, right, they're making. They're not going to have a whole lot of money to contribute to the water system. And then NGOs. Right? And part of the question is, if the people don't pay for it, is it going to be sustainable? Right? Is it going to last, right, if the people don't pay for it? Right? Because once it breaks, what's going to happen? Are they going to rely on somebody else to come in and fix it for them? That's probably not going to work. Right? Investing in water systems, is it worth it? Right? The U.S. dollar, this is all in U.S. dollars. It doesn't mean this is in the United States. This is U.S. dollars. Everything was mentioned. This is a research. This is a project that was done by the World Health Organization. Right? And what their estimates are that $700 billion annually. First of all, the Millennium Development Goals. Is that people familiar with that? Right? The Millennium Development Goals, if you're not familiar, are goals that were set up by the United Nations, where they would try to they would try to cut back on the number of people in the world who don't have clean water, who don't have sanitation, who are not educated. They have a whole bunch of different goals. If the Millennium Development Goals were met by 2015, right, $7 billion annually will be saved in healthcare savings to health agencies. $340 million annually to individuals, $10 billion annually in productive gains, $63 billion annually in just the time savings. So people, instead of spending time getting water, bringing water back, and boiling the water so they could drink it, they could be doing work. They could be producing things, right, where there's economic benefit. And then $3.6 billion annually in lives saved. Right? In other words, a person who doesn't die is much more likely to generate money than a person who has died, obviously. Right? Estimated ranges of return. Right? In other words, what's the rate of return? If you put so much money into something, what do you get back? Now we're talking worldwide. Right? So if the world puts so much money into water systems for people who don't have water systems, what's the return? The most conservative return is $4, right, for every $1 invested, right? The range goes from $4 to $34, right? So for every dollar invested by the World Health Organization is estimating that the return on that dollar will be between $4 and $34. I wouldn't mind having money invested and getting a return like that, right? There's not much of that happening. And then there's just the most recent health WHO study said total payback $84 billion a year. If $84 billion a year was invested into these systems, 11.3 billion, I'm sorry, 11.3 billion was invested, 84 billion would be the return, which is a rate of return of 7.4. Right? So that is pretty much the latest number, 7.4 rate of return for investment in water systems. Right? Now, potential for conflict. There are a lot of potentials for conflict. Right? Water systems, because it's a necessity to live, right? Everybody has a vested interest in a water system. Right? So I just kind of try to categorize some of these places of potential conflict. Persons or groups other than the community who own or control the water source. We had a problem in Uslala, St. Pedro Uslala, where we were asked to come out and evaluate and see if we could put a water system in. So we went, we visited, and we took measurements and we did some surveying. And somebody in the community who ends up being related to the person who owned the source said, well, if you put the water system in, I would like to get water to my home also, which is on the way to the school. If you don't know, if Water Uslala has an agreement, makes an agreement with the community that they'll supply water to the school and the church. Right? Anybody else who wants to tie in is welcome to, but Water Uslala only supplies water to the school and the church. And then anybody along the way can tap into it. The owner of the source said he would sign it over and he would protect it with restrictions on that. So he said he would protect the source, limit it. However, when he found out that his relative was higher than the source and therefore we couldn't get water up there to him, he decided that he no longer wanted to give the source to the community. Right? So now, because he wasn't happy with what physically could or couldn't happen, this community gets no water. Because the community, for us to put a water system in, we have to know that the community owns the water source. Because we don't want to put it in and then have the owner and just retract it, no longer applicable. Right? So there's a source of conflict. We've had problems where there's been a water system already in place, and the community comes to us and says, well, we're not getting water. We had a water system in here years ago, but now we're not getting water. Can you come and look at it and see if you can figure out what's wrong with our water system? We go, and we find out that one of the pipes has been cut. Why was the pipe cut? Well, the woman who owned the property where the pipe went through decided she didn't want to pay for water anymore because you have to pay charge for water. Right? So they said, well, if she didn't pay, she couldn't have water. So she said, well, if she couldn't have water, neither could anybody else, and cut the pipe on her property. Right? These things could have been worked out, right? But you got to be aware and you got to think about it. This conflict stuff, all they have to do is kind of work things out. They can be worked out, but these things happen. When you put a water system in like this, usually what you require is sweat equity. In other words, if people don't have a lot of money, so you say, well, okay, we will kind of technically pay you to work. In other words, you'll put the water system in yourself. Right? You'll do all the labor. Right? We'll give you credit for doing the labor, and then we'll count that credit as your investment into the water system. And it works pretty well because not only do people have the sweat equity, that water system, but they also know how it works and they know how to fix it because they did it. Right? But 5 years from now, somebody moves into the neighborhood. They weren't there when it was installed, so they couldn't have put sweat equity in. They also don't have the money to put in to the system now, which this community says anybody who joins now has to contribute X number of dollars to get into our system. This is a conflict. Right? This is a problem. This is neighbors, not getting along with neighbors. Neighbors have a problem with this. These things have to be worked out up front. What will be the agreement? Is there a way of getting these people to somehow be able to put sweat? Maybe they could be used to maintain the system, right, and use that as their sweat equity. Oddly enough, you kind of think that, well, everybody would want us to put a water system in. However, there were people we mentioned before who were selling water to the community in open barrels, in trucks, and things of that sort. Well, if this community has a water system, These people don't have a business anymore. We just put people out of business. Right? How do you deal with this? Right? This is a problem that you have to anticipate up front. Because otherwise you're going to have unhappy people who are going to be doing things to your system. Right? So people won't be getting water because they'll be damaging things, that sort of. On occasion, people have put in their own systems and then charge people exorbitant amounts of money for the water. This doesn't work. And the other problem we've run into is when you build a system that only serves part of a community or multiple communities, you have a problem because if it's part of a community, the other half of the community, the other part of the community is upset because how come they got water and we didn't? Right? If it's multiple communities, frequently people have different interests or different amounts of water, different things they use water for agriculture, for animals, right, for bathing, or maybe just for drinking, right? So but people have different interests. So these interests have to be pointed out and taken care of up front. Right? In other words, what is the water going to be used for? Who's going to be using it? And if you, for example, we put a water system into a school, anybody on the upside of the school can easily tap into the water system. Anybody on the downside of the school has no pipes to tap into because the pipes stopped at the school. That has to be accounted for. I guess to understand either that's how it's going to be, or maybe you have to extend it right from the beginning down through to the lowest, house in the area. Right? And that's pretty much it. I have a lot of questions. The reason I'm here is because I had a lot of questions. I said, you know what I'd like to do is I'd like to find out what the costs were and how do you deal with it. And somebody said, oh, okay, once you got to talk. I don't know the answers, I just have questions. All right? I'm hoping some of my colleagues here have some of the answers to it. All right?
Yeah. Thanks, James. Thanks, James. That was quite interesting for me. I hope for the group as well. Chris Kilby is going to give us the economics, the kind of money piece here, the investment piece.
I don't want to promise too much. All right. Jim's already covered a lot of ground, made me start scratching out things because he's hit a lot of very important points. I want to shift our focus just a little bit. Many of the, I guess, the locations that we're thinking about looking at when Jim is speaking are really rural or small village. And that's, I think, a very important area for water development. Another important area, though, is more urban. And some of the problems there are quite extreme, in part because people are living so close together, and also because of the extreme poverty that we see. So I want to just run through a couple of pictures I have here to set the scene, I guess. This is Nairobi. This is a view from the Mathare Valley. You can see a very large slum. There's over 1 million people who live in the slum, down sort of below the high-rise towers that are the modern section of the city. Many of these pictures are going to come from here. You'll see that it's not highly developed. These are people who have just sort of moved into this open area and started building things out of mud, cardboard, and if they're doing well, they'll have a corrugated steel roof. There, as you can see in the foreground here, there are just piles of trash. And this, in a sense, is very organized because the trash has been put into piles rather than just being everywhere. And that's a sign both of the poverty and also of the fact that there are no services being provided. There's no organized system for taking away the trash from more than 1 million people. Another view here, you can see, probably can pick out here that there's actually agricultural activity going on. And here we can see it better with the goats, agricultural activities going on mixed in. So you've got all sorts of animals in close quarters with people. And then finally you can see here how the kids are living. In the front there is a bathtub that's not currently being used, this wash basin, and all the kids running around. You can imagine that when you walk into that house, you're not going to see a shower and a toilet and a sink and all that. None of that is available. And in fact, if you want a bath, this is how you do it. You hope you have a very loving mom who in this case has trekked somewhere to get clean water, that's the jug there, and is giving, I'm guessing it's her son, but could be her daughter, a bath here. All right, so that's, when we're thinking about urban water, this is the setting that sort of in the back of the mind that we're trying to address. These pictures have come from Kenya, but situations are similar in South Asia. Particularly, it's the disposal, the sanitation side that tends to be the big issue. So here you can see, I think it's probably kids playing in a canal that doesn't look too appealing. Here's another picture of this one with a lot of trash that's accumulated around, again, sort of a slum area. And then here, this is a picture more of a rural area, but again, of a sanitation issue. There's just sort of a collected pool that you wouldn't want to go near. So this sort of sets the frame of the issues that we're thinking about. And those issues have been sort of the focus of some of the Millennium Development Goals, these targets that were set by major donors of milestones to accomplish by the year 2015. And one of those was to cut in half the proportion of the population living without access to clean drinking water and basic sanitation. And in terms of the drinking water side, we are on track to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Largely, this is driven by improvements in China and India, and it doesn't really have that much to do with what the donor community, the rich countries giving to poorer countries, what they've accomplished. It's more about what's going on in those countries. And in fact, you can see that when you break it down. I give you at the bottom here how we're doing in the Pacific Islands, in sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. And you can see that in the first two cases, we're not expected to meet the Millennium Development Goal targets by 2015. And the statement that we're on track is really then looking at other areas of the world that are doing much better. The situation is less positive when we look at the rural-urban, and in fact this is a good reason why Jim's talk was so important, that it really is the rural areas that are lagging behind. Even though we see this striking pictures in urban areas, rural areas are terribly important. And then it's also less positive if we look at sanitation. So think about that essentially as the disposal of water and byproducts rather than the water coming into the community. And there we see much less progress. Things look particularly bad in South Asia, and that's because of the density of population. When people are living very close together, it's relatively easy to provide the water, but relatively hard to provide the sanitation. So that's largely what's driving that. But the Millennium Development Goal is not likely to be reached on the sanitation front. Now this has sort of been a rallying cry in a way to focus world attention on issues of water and of sanitation. And so I'd like to, at this point then, switch to talking a little bit directly about that, about the sort of the economic theory behind this, thinking about what the central issues are in the economics of water provision. The most striking element of this is the natural monopoly nature of water provision, for that matter of sanitation more generally. When you think about a water provision system, thinking about the pipes and everything, there's a tremendous upfront fixed cost. And then the operating cost, the variable cost of delivering an extra gallon or an extra liter of water is very low. Okay? And in that setting, it makes sense, and this is, I guess, sort of obvious, it makes sense to have one system for everyone. In other words, that there's only going to be one set of pipes running into a town or a city, and that's what's going to be available. There aren't going to be, say, 5 different pipes going by your house, run by different organizations, and you get to decide which one to tap into. We're going to be looking at a system where it's a natural monopoly, where there's a high fixed cost, a very low variable cost, and therefore sensible that there only be one provider. A second important issue, as we've seen throughout this discussion, is that water is just a very critical input, both in terms of drinking, but also in terms of sanitation. So the idea that we could just do without, if it's expensive, doesn't fly very well. And then finally, added to this mix, another central issue is the externalities involved. And this is particularly when we're thinking about sanitation, that when individual is able to deal properly with waste and other things, then they're less likely to be passing on to others various diseases. So the idea that there are benefits to others of me undertaking activities is very important here. One of the key issues that we focus on is the role of fees. So why is it, what roles does charging people for water play? And there are really two central roles. One is to generate revenue. If we think about paying back for an initial investment, if we think about covering the operating costs, and probably most importantly, if we think about how to make a system sustainable so that it can expand when the population grows and so that it can be maintained over time, we need a source of revenue. So this is a very important reason for fees. A second one is the allocation of a scarce resource. If people are paying for water, then they're going to be more careful in how they use it. If you're in a situation where the variable cost of water, the availability of water, is not an issue, then making people pay to try to, it's not a scarce resource, and that's not a good justification. But increasingly, in many situations, we are looking at it being a scarce resource. We do want people to sensibly limit their use. Because we've seen a persistent undersupply of clean water and sanitation by the traditional methods, namely through the public sector, increasing attention has focused on, well, what about private provision of water? If the government's not doing a good job, maybe there's a good way to open it up to private industry. One of the positive elements here, the appeal of this, is that there is an incentive to collect fees. So under a government-run system, there's not a strong incentive to go out and make sure the user fees are being paid, because the individuals involved aren't particularly benefiting from that. In fact, they may do better not to collect the fees. Once we've introduced private corporations, some sort of private company, then there's a strong incentive to do the collection. This also opens up the possibility of the expansion of service. If this is indeed a profitable undertaking for a private enterprise, then it may make sense for them to expand service to people who didn't have it before. And again, we can think about incentives for maintenance. If you're a firm that owns a water supply system, all else equal, you would prefer that it continues to work. In other words, it makes sense for you to maintain it. So these are all things that are appealing about private provision that may, I should emphasize the may work better than public provision. There are also problems here, though, because we're looking necessarily at a regulated monopoly. We know that it's going to be a monopoly because it's a natural monopoly with a high fixed cost. But because of that, then we don't want an unregulated monopoly that could charge people as much as possible. Rather, we're likely to go down the path of a regulated monopoly. That implies at the beginning that we're looking at privatizing the existing system. And that is a process that's very fraught with problems. One of the problems is figuring out what the system is actually worth. It's typically buried underground, and there'll be very poor records on what's been done to it. So it's very hard to assess what is a private company actually getting. Another is, in terms of the process of privatization, is who gets it and what politics are involved. Often a system would be sold at far lower than its market value for reasons that have to do with private interests and lack of transparency in government. When we get beyond the privatization stage, we need to think about the regulatory structure. What are the incentives built into that, if it's a regulated monopoly? What are the incentives built into it to ensure efficiency? If it's purely on a cost-plus basis, and if there are rules that prevent, say, shutting off water, then it may be that if a private firm also doesn't have a strong incentive to keep costs under control. There are also the question then of the incentives for maintenance and investment. I talked about that as a positive aspect, but that's only true if the firm is taking a long-term view. It's also possible that the firm is essentially trying to run the system into the ground to get as much short-term profit as possible. Which way the firm goes is going to depend critically on what incentives it faces under the regulatory system. And a final concern, and this has been a big issue in the US and elsewhere, is the issue of regulatory capture. We argue that we need experts in the field to be the regulators, but they are typically then drawn out of the industry that they're regulating. They maybe are also thinking about going back into the industry that they're regulating, which creates a rather mixed set of incentives for them. And we don't know that we'll actually be seeing that efficient regulation of this monopoly. So the fact that it's going to be a monopoly means that the private sector may be a solution, but it's not an easy solution. It's not the sort of perfect competition, just let the markets run away with it kind of story. it's clear up front that that's not going to work well. There are also problems that are specific to poor countries. There are problems of shallow capital markets. If we're thinking about the process of either privatization or trying to expand an existing system that's going to require a large upfront investment, the shallowness of the capital markets, the lack of an active stock market for equity investment, for banking system and whatnot, is going to limit the ability of the private sector being able to go in. Often this ends up meaning that it's a foreign firm that comes in and is the privatizer of the company that buys it up. And that obviously raises a host of issues when a vital resource is now being controlled by a foreign corporation for the purposes of generating profit. There are big informational issues. I mentioned not being able to value very well what the system is worth. That is compounded in a developing country where information is going to be very scarce. This is important both at the privatization stage, how much should the price be for a public system that's being sold off, and it's also important when we think about trying to figure out whether a regulated monopoly has actually been doing the investment that it's supposed to be doing, since we have trouble turning up this information. The idea of government failure is written large when we're looking at developing countries. The reason that the water system isn't working well in the current state is essentially about politics and bureaucracy, about government failure. But as we switch over to thinking about markets, we also have to realize that there are equally large and serious market failures in developing countries. So the idea that simply switching over to a private approach is going to solve the problems, again, is less likely to work in a developing country. And then finally, in terms of these issues, when we think about water provision in the US or in a developed country, we think about the sort of level of cleanliness of the water in terms of long-term issues, like how many birth defects are we going to see? What's the incidence of cancer going to be? Things that are not in the order of communicable diseases. When we're switching context and looking in the context of a developing country, if a private system is operating badly, or for that matter, if a public system is operating badly, we're going to see communicable diseases, cholera, diarrhea, all sorts of other diseases being possible. In other words, things that there are now negative externalities for other people very directly. All right. The last set of issues that I'd like to turn to is the politics of water privatization. In particular, sort of jumping to my own area of research, looking at the international side. The World Bank has been a big player in setting the international agenda on all sorts of issues, certainly in terms of privatization of state-owned enterprises. This has been a big area. And in the past, World Bank policy on water, but on other things as well, has been privatized with an exclamation point, essentially since the 1980s, very strongly pushing the idea that privatizing is going to help the state, but also help better delivery of services. These days, it's changed more to privatize, maybe please, with the point of view that the World Bank is presenting a more circumspect point of view. They are saying, well, you might want to consider privatization as one of your options. Although when you look at what they discuss, it turns out that in terms of their publications, that's the only one where they lay out toolkits on how you do it. The other ones, they say it's an option, but then they don't really go any further in that direction. Why this change? Why is it that it's not so heavy-handed in pushing privatization? One reason is the Millennium Development Goals. The idea that we're going to fall short on the Millennium Development Goals, and the donor nations, the US and other donor nations, seeing this as a goal that they want to accomplish. They've then started backing away from things that are clearly, that may have a negative short-run effect. So for example, in a different arena, 10 years ago, the World Bank was saying you have to charge school fees when people go to public schools. That's the way we're going to get them to be sustainable. And in recent years, the World Bank has switched 180 degrees and now says there should be no school fees. And the one reason that people can point to very clearly is that we are on track to fail on the Millennium Development Goals in terms of education. And it was seen as a very quick way to accomplish that. So whatever arguments there were for charging school fees, those still exist. It's just they're no longer compatible with the short-term interests of donors. So that argument, I think, applies as well to water provision. The donors aren't pushing privatization as hard anymore because they see in the short run privatization might not deliver clean water to more people, even if it did, in the long run, provide more sustainable systems. And the second reason for the World Bank changing its position is that infrastructure is back. The World Bank had some major egg on its face in the early 1990s regarding major infrastructure projects that they were supporting, particularly the Narmada Dam system in India, and their response was to run screaming from the room. They stopped supporting large-scale infrastructure projects in water and in other areas, and they went off and did other things. They then discovered in the mid-2000s that they were having trouble lending enough money. They didn't have enough demand for their services. And suddenly it occurred to them, hey, there are these multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects out there that we could do. And now they've come back. So if you look, say, the 3 years prior to 2006, they had about $3 billion in infrastructure, in water infrastructure lending. And the 3 years after 2006, they went up to $23 billion in water lending. And all of that was essentially driven by a management about-face saying, if we're going to survive as a bank, this is what we need to do. Again, you might think that that's sort of a poor basis for determining policy in developing countries. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chris. Now, Barbara Wall is going to try to synthesize some of this, point out some of the major themes that will lead us to our Q&A. We should have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you both to Jim and Chris for an enlightening afternoon in terms of the engineering issues involved and the economic issues involved. I had not heard their or read their paper before this or their perspective, so I'm responding as I've heard it. And one of the things that I'd like to share with you in the limited time that I have before the Q&A is, as a philosopher, not an economist, certainly not an engineer. How many of you are engineers here? Great, isn't that wonderful? Thank you. I'd like to begin with a story about my experience of water in Africa. Several years ago, I was privileged to accompany a group of our students to Ghana on an International Habitat for Humanity project. We were there 17 days. And there was no electricity, no running water, etc. The water, we were advised before we went there that, number one, do not drink the water, drink bottled water. Number two, do not even go in the streams nearby. Now, we were 4 degrees north of the equator. It was very hot. But even as you make cement to build bricks, to build the homes that you were working on, be sure your hands are not in the sand or in the water. That was the CDC's warning in terms of the parasites that would travel through our bodies almost immediately. And so it was quite an experience. We were given bottled water to drink, and we were given 1 bucket of water a day to wash and do all those sorts of things with. It was amazing in many ways to realize all that you could do with just 1 bucket of water a day. Coming from the freedom to just turn on a tap. I mean, appreciation of just water and how essential it is to life. How essential it is to communities that are in dire poverty, not just because it's essential for their very life and their health, but also it's essential to grow the kinds of foods they need in order to survive. Now, in this little community that we were in, the mortality rate was very high. People rarely lived beyond the age of 47. In fact, when they asked me my age, the women in the community would come and build a fire every morning and make breakfast for us, etc. They ran off to the village, and they came back with about 12 or 15 other women asking me how old I was again. And they had to touch me and make sure, are you sure you're that old? I was 50 at the time. And it was just inconceivable to them that anyone would be as old as I was and look as healthy as I did. So the very issue of water was very, very important for us, given our lifestyle here in the United States, and how many of us take the issue of water for granted. In the Christian tradition, water has a very important sacramental context. It's used in so many of our important rituals for blessing, for conversion, for commitment. It's a sign of a new life. It's a sign of life. It has always been a sacrament of life, if you will. So one of the obvious questions I have, as coming from the realm of philosophy and theology, is there a right to water? Do people have a right to clean water? As part of the fact that in so much of Catholic social teaching we read, what does human dignity mean? What are the constituents of human dignity? As we read Pacem in Terris of John the 23rd, at the very center is human dignity, and spiraling out from that are constitutive rights, if you will. That rights are not focused on individualism, but the essentials for human flourishing. And also, I would say, water is essential for the flourishing of the planet, is it not? Where do we go when we begin to think about the ethical demands of ensuring human dignity, human flourishing for all peoples? Is not water essential in that process? So we talk about conflict. What kind of process do we put in place to adjudicate claims in conflict? Where is the common good in all of this discourse on water, on rural, urban areas, on monopolizing, monopolies that might establish water, the costs of bringing potable water to people? What is the role and the responsibility of governments to ensure that people have the bare essentials for human life? Namely, water is one of them, is it not? Can you survive as a human being without water, without clean water? So these are important questions, I think, that have to also be addressed in terms of whose responsibility is it to ensure that people have water? I take it for granted, don't you? And because I can afford it, I use it, right? Well, one thing I try to do in terms of just bringing a deeper appreciation of the fact that there are a lot of people throughout the world that do not have access to the wealth that I have, or just even water. How do I save and conserve? How do I change my lifestyle to accommodate and to conserve water? How do I change my lifestyle in ways that also the water I use on my garden, etc., doesn't go into larger containments where pesticides, etc., continue to poison and pollute the water that we have access to so freely? These, I think, are major questions when we talk about the poor of the world. And I return to that village in Africa, Bremen Fuswanza, and how critical water was for us there, but also for the people who basically lived off the land. When we look at the future of the planet, we're dealing with issues such as drought, floods, melting glaciers, rising sea levels, resource conflicts, and massive disruptions, particularly along coastal areas all over the world, where water is not in balance with the other needs of creation. And one of the things that I think Christopher referred to is that if something is not priced, it's not valued. Well, is that the only way of looking at, he didn't say that, I'm saying that, okay, of the commodity of water? as a resource. How can we, in a world that has so much privilege when it comes to being able to drink a glass of water, and aren't you delighted that we have pitchers of water and not plastic bottles of water? Yeah. How do we change so much of what we do in order to ensure that water, which is a privilege for so many throughout the world, and we take for granted, to ensure that others also might have water? Do we really consider transformation of our lifestyle? So many of you engineers did that, was it last year or the year before, when you went over and started to put your expertise into work with, in some of the residence halls, changing shower heads so that less water would be used. And you calculated how many gallons would be saved, et cetera, et cetera. This is great. This is wonderful. Taking some stewardship responsibility to ensure that clean, potable water is not extravagantly wasted. To take some responsibility for that. So I would just leave you with the thought, since we really want to get some of your questions, where is the common good in this? What are some of the ethical questions that we need to raise in terms of responsibility of government, responsibility of corporations or companies, and the responsibility of the IMF in terms of, again, ethical considerations to regulate how this extraordinary resource can be made available to more and more people. And what are the ways in which we can put in process possibilities for resolution of conflict that don't have to become stalemates, or ways in which people are cut off from considering alternative possibilities to move beyond. So it's a multifaceted kind of response, I think, that we need to look at some of the underlying questions. But I go back again to the position in Catholic social teaching that human flourishing, human dignity, is a right of every single human being, not just of a few in the developed world. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. So we have about 15 minutes. I'd like to encourage you to ask questions of the panelists. I also have a couple of announcements to make at the very end. So who's got a question? Someone's got to have a question. A lot of people out there. We have a microphone here, or you can speak loudly. Do we have? It's cordless, great.
I can't guarantee it speak loud.
Testing. I find all these panelists, their expertise is wonderful, and it challenges the furniture of my mind. And I know that I, at this point, perhaps living in two different worlds, I share the world that is described by the panelists and the concern from a medical point of view, because that's been our mission as medical mission sisters. We have had to challenge ourselves to rethink what is it that constitutes health for people. And it is not possible to think of health for people apart from the health of the community of life, the whole community of life, which of course includes water, water, air, the essential things. So that I find the challenge I would like to face is how to integrate the wonderful knowledge and expertise of these other professions, so that the whole community of life benefits, and not simply from the point of view of an economy or from the point of view of engineering or any of those things. Because we have to be careful of the unintended consequences.
Responses?
I'll go ahead and dive in. Great, thank you. I think that's a very important point, and if you look in organizations that are actively involved in trying to provide water in developing countries, there are a whole bunch of different specialties that are drawn on. It's not just economists, it's not just engineers. These days, there are also anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists who all are drawn in. So I think the potential to look at a very integrated approach to the provision of water and to think about its effects very broadly are there. What tends to vary, though, is the political will to really follow the direction that all that work points in. And I think that that's really the fundamental issue.
Can I just say that I have found, reading recently, Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, very helpful in trying to understand a lot of what Chris referred to as the economics involved in trying particularly to deal with some of these very stressed areas throughout the world where people are struggling and not making it, if you will. And particularly in Africa, as he points out, far more, the 38 million below the poverty level, so many of that number are in Africa for a number of reasons, and he details. It helps you at least get some perspective on it.
You have another taker?
Hi. I sort of have a question because it just occurred to me during your discussion, and the question really is there an opportunity for social entrepreneurship to perhaps have an impact in privatization, and perhaps trying to set up some local stakeholders or local ownership within that framework of privatization to solve some of these issues?
That's a great question. I think that if we look very broadly at what social entrepreneurship is, we'll see that that's exactly what's been going on for decades and decades, that people within communities have said we need water. We can probably, I'm not a good historian of this, I think probably Jim knows a little more, but if you go back and you look historically on communities in the United States getting water, again, a lot of it is driven by the local community. One problem with this, though, in terms of thinking of it as sort of an easy solution, is that, and this has been raised by a couple of people, there's a lot of politics involved. In other words, you're not just going into a community where everybody is equally empowered and somebody decides it's a good idea to do this. There are going to be different interests, and the person who ends up taking the leadership role isn't necessarily representing the oppressed in society. They may be representing some other interest. So, for example, they may be a wealthy landowner who could use better irrigation on their land, and they are the single person who's going to benefit most from the system, and they may then be the force driving behind getting that system in place. So it certainly is an important role, but it's something that we have, as sort of the outsiders looking at this, you can't assume that every instance of it is going to be a positive one.
One question for you. From an engineering aspect, water, I guess I have a mild voice here. Water basically isn't always as abundant in all the different areas. It might be harder to get it. I mean, Jim's example, you have the gravity of the mountains and a lot of rain down in Central America. Obviously, that's not the case in a desert environment. How much should the World Bank be looking at things like where people are living as part of the solution?
Can I jump in here? Sorry to monopolize this. So there actually was a recent study done by the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, which looks at each individual project and also broadly thematically. And they essentially wanted to see whether World Bank funding across different countries was well correlated with the water needs across those countries, which would be closely aligned with your idea of scarcity. And what they found was broadly the answer was no. Now, there are various reasons for that. It may be that countries that are overall doing well demand more loans to work on their water systems than countries that are struggling. But nonetheless, the answer is that the allocation of resources thus far hasn't followed the scarcity or the need very well.
Partly from the consequences of the climate disruption that's occurring in front of our eyes. But also simply because it is so difficult in practice to actually deliver water and other essential resources in many of these communities. There's a prospect of masses of global refugees in the near future knocking on our doors and a lot of other doors. Do you think it's realistic to provide people with these resources where they are so they're not coming here as environmental refugees?
I think it's almost mandatory that we do it that way. I think we would save a whole lot of money by addressing the people's needs where they are, so that they can live and survive, rather than having to move. The expenses to deal with them at some future time will be astronomical, in my opinion. And I think we have to do it the way you're suggesting.
Yeah, several years ago, Lester Brown was here, and he spoke about what he considered to be the major crisis in the future, which was water, fresh water, potable water. And he said it will cause all kinds of international disruptions in population. He said part of it also is the fact that given the population growth, it's tied in with the population growth. He said within the next 50 years, or actually less than the next 50 years, we will double the Earth's population. And the point he was trying to make was unless we attend to the population growth, but also unless we attend to the limited natural resources, there's no way that we will have enough water, fresh water, for human living or to sustain the planet in the future. This was his prediction. But in some ways, it's incumbent upon us to be wise stewards of this treasure of water, and also wise stewards in many ways of trying to make it possible in some ways for people to be self-determining economically where they are in ways that would enable them to at least flourish in that environment. In some ways, it's an insurance policy for us in the developed world that we will continue to prosper. If you wanted to do it just even for selfish motives, that's kind of what I'm getting, not anything altruistic. So they're big issues.
Just to follow up on Barbara's point, I guess I would say that if we're looking at why we should do it from selfish motives, we've already missed a large part of the point, that we ought to be doing this because it is important for people to stay where they are for themselves, not for us. And that should be the starting point, not to think about, if we've already lost that fight, then we're in bad shape, I guess I would say.
I agree.
You were referring to a speaker who was here a few years ago, and George McGovern was also here a few years ago, and he spoke about the issue of population growth. And one of the issues that really ties into population growth is delaying childbirth in girls. And the longer they stay in school, the shorter their childbearing, the longer that they delay having children. And so if there's more potable water and more easily available, that also helps the education of women, girls, who are primarily the people that go and get the water, and it affects the growth of population. It slows down the rate of childbirth in these countries. So it's all connected in a way.
Just to follow up on that, I think that's an excellent point, and I think it even goes beyond that. If you think about one of the motives to have children is to have a certain number who survive. And something that kills a lot of under 5 children is unclean water. So that on its own, is going to reduce population growth. And then secondly, not needing people to carry water around again reduces the reasons for having such a large family. So it's all tied together in the direction that you indicated.
One other issue I would just add to that is the Vatican's response to the issue, of the question of population control, is that it's not just all about population, it's also about consumption.
Yeah.
and the ways in which we've been unable to self-regulate our own obsessive consumptive behaviors that has really affected the environment we live in as well.
Okay, that's about the time that we have. I'd like to make 3 quick announcements and then collectively thank our panelists. First off, for anyone who wants more information on Catholic Relief Services or its programming, there is contact information at the table outside the Villanova room. Secondly, there is a student registration sheet for those who need that, also at the table. And also, I was told there may be a student who wants to make a brief announcement about Wednesday's Water Solidarity Day. Is that student here?